There once was a young boy who at the age of 3 became a living god, chosen by divine mandate to be the absolute ruler of over 400 million people. By the time that boy had become an old man, he had been reduced to a humble street sweeper in the suburbs of Beijing. This remarkable transformation bookends the life of a man who wore many faces throughout the course of his life. From the son of heaven, to urban socialite, to war criminal, to gulag inmate, to reformed communist. In this video, we will explore the fate of a child emperor whose deposition marked the end of a dynastic tradition which had endured over 2,000 years. A boy who was given all the privilege in the world, yet was powerless to stop himself from being swept up into the tumult of the blood-soaked 20th century. Welcome to the fascinating and tragic story of Puyi, the last emperor of China. Perhaps there could have been a way for Puyi to keep his empire, but he never found it. But right now, we'll tell you the way to keep something you might stand to lose in your life, your hair. This troublesome problem has a solution: our sponsor Keeps. If you're a guy, there's a 2 in 3 chance that by the time you're 35, male pattern baldness will be cutting back your hairline, possibly all the way to nothing. The only cure is prevention, so it's important to start hair loss treatment as soon as you're worried about what's going on up there. With Keeps, this is easy. You can get an online consultation to set up a treatment plan with the help of a hair loss professional, customized for the result you're seeking. You'll be sent all the products you need and instructions for using them without having to ever go see a doctor or pharmacist in person. It's as convenient as it is discreet, and while the reality is that it's not always possible to stop hair loss, you certainly won't stop it if you don't try. With over 1 million men treated and over 5,000 5-star reviews, Keeps will get the job done if anything can, so it's the best place to get started. Thanks to Keeps for sponsoring this video. Hair loss stops with Keeps. For a special offer to get started, go to keeps.com/kingsandgenerals or click the link in the description. That's keeps.com/kingsandgenerals. In 1644, the Manchus of the Xingyuro clan, a non-Chinese people from the far northeast, conquered Beijing, supplanting the native Han Chinese Ming dynasty and establishing themselves at the head of a new dynasty, the Great Qing. At the height of its power, the Qing dynasty ruled over a fourth of all humanity, while possessing the largest economy in the world. But by the 19th century, their decline had begun. Like the Ming dynasty before them, the emperors of Qing practiced a closed-door policy of national isolation. Soon those doors were being knocked on with increasingly audacious insistence by the colonial empires of Europe, who decided that causing a national opioid crisis was an acceptable way to get their hands on Chinese tea. This boiled over into the First Opium War, in which the Qing got a harsh reality check on just how behind they were on the technological skill tree. By the twilight of the 1800s, a guy decided he was the brother of Jesus Christ and started an ethno-religious uprising that got 20 million people killed, while an increasingly anemic Qing government kept losing wars to and signing unequal treaties with foreign powers like Britain, France, Russia and Japan. All the while, famine and disease had reaped a bloody harvest throughout the land, and resentment among the general Chinese population against their hated Manchu overlords had slowly reached a boiling point. As the sun rose over the 20th century, it cast its light upon a sick, dying empire that was militarily insignificant, politically impotent, and widely despised by its subjects. 5 years later, its last emperor, Xingyuro Puyi, was born. Little Puyi, a distant half-nephew of the reigning Guangxu emperor, spent the first 2 years of his existence living with his parents in a lavish mansion in central Beijing. Then, one night, an honor guard of imperial cavalrymen escorting a cohort of eunuch palanquin bearers swung into the family yard. They announced that the emperor, a man with no direct heirs, was dead and that they had come for the boy. Terrified by this throng of strangers, Puyi sobbed and struggled as smiling, obsequious eunuchs tried to pick him up and put him in the litter. Only his beloved wet nurse, Mrs. Wang, was able to get Puyi to cooperate, calming the boy by putting him to her breast and climbing into the palanquin while he fed. Puyi's mother could only watch in muted shock as her son was taken away from her. She would not see him again for 7 years. 2 weeks after that, Puyi was officially crowned in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The toddler cried throughout the coronation ceremony, frightened by the deafening sounds of the ceremonial drums. From that day forward, the tiny tot took on the regnal name of the Xuantong Emperor and officially became the heavenly mandated monarch of over 400 million people. Puyi was the single most pampered young boy in the world. An army of simpering eunuchs attended to his every need, dressing him, washing him, and carrying him to and fro across the Forbidden City on a gilded palanquin. All he had to say was, "I'm hungry," and a huge buffet was set up wherever he happened to be. He could also relieve himself wherever he wanted, for a eunuch was constantly in attendance with the royal chamber pot at the ready. Puyi had no real family save for his so-called mothers, the former concubines of his imperial predecessor, who he felt no love for. As it turns out, when a preschooler is brought up with practically no parental supervision, treated like a living god, and given thousands of servants who he can do whatever he wants to, he becomes a tiny sadist. Indeed, young Puyi soon began finding malicious joy in having his servants brutally flogged for his amusement. One time he had a cake baked with iron filings inside it, so he could feed it to one of his eunuchs because he wanted to see what he looked like when he ate it. The only person capable of reining in Puyi's morbid appetites was his beloved wet nurse, Mrs. Wang, whose breast he fed at until he was 8 years old. Ultimately, Puyi's reign as Emperor of China didn't even make it to his puberty. In 1911, an army rebellion in Wuchang snowballed into a national uprising. It took just 6 months for the imperial regime to collapse, and for a new nation, the Republic of China, to rise in its place. Just like that, nearly 300 years of Manchu domination over the Han Chinese people was over, and a dynastic system which had endured for over 2,000 years had come to an end. In February of 1912, Yuan Shikai, a former Qing general and now provisional president of the newborn Republic of China, struck a deal with one of Puyi's so-called mothers, the Empress Dowager Longyu. This agreement became ratified as the Articles of Favorable Treatment. In return for the young emperor's willing abdication, he would be allowed to remain in the Forbidden City, continue using the imperial title, and continue living his opulent lifestyle. Thus, while Puyi remained emperor within the walls of the Forbidden City, outside of it he was now nothing more than an antiquated relic, living in a gilded time capsule. With that said, Puyi still remained on the political radar. In 1916, the Republic of China fractured into zones of influence controlled by local warlords. One of these warlords, the northern strongman Jiang Shun, marched on Beijing in July of 1917, took over the city, declared the revival of the Qing dynasty, and restored Puyi to the Dragon Throne. This lasted for all of 2 weeks before Jiang Shun's troops were chased out of Beijing by Republican forces. After that, Puyi was dethroned a second time, and the imperial court within the Forbidden City was once more reduced to a theatre without an audience. When Puyi reached his early teens, he received a Western tutor, the renowned Scottish scholar Reginald Johnston. Puyi developed an immediate admiration for the erudite Scotsman, who not only taught the boy English, but introduced him to Western technology like bicycles, telephones, and movies, all of which Puyi took to with gleeful fascination. Under Johnston's influence, Puyi cut his traditional Manchu braid, grew a full head of hair in the Western style, and even began insisting his eunuchs start calling him Henry. Johnston was also responsible for insisting, against the wishes of the palace eunuchs, that Puyi be given prescription glasses. The old Scotsman had started as Puyi's tutor, but had quickly become the only true friend he had ever had. In 1922, Puyi reached his sweet 16, and it was time to think about marriage. Given a selection of photographs of well-bred teenage girls to pick from, the hedonistic youth chose not one wife but 2. His primary empress would be Gobolo Wanrong, the daughter of a wealthy Manchu aristocrat, while a Mongolian noble girl, the 12-year-old Udut Wengshu, would serve as his secondary consort. On his wedding night, Puyi timidly fled from the bridal chamber without consummating, which made sense since he was an extremely sheltered teenager who had spent the majority of his life around men without genitalia. Throughout his teen years, Puyi yearned desperately to leave the walls of the Forbidden City, which he had been confined to for as long as he could remember. In particular, he wanted to travel to England and study at Oxford University, just like Mr. Johnston had. Soon his wish to see the outside world would be fulfilled, with a curl of the monkey's paw. In October of 1924, the warlord Feng Yuxiang conquered Beijing. In a move that he believed would make him popular with the masses, General Yuxiang abolished the Articles of Favorable Treatment, reduced Puyi to a private citizen of the Republic of China, and evicted him from the Forbidden City. The pampered bird had been shooed out of its gilded cage, and now he and his 2 wives were out on the street. Basically homeless, Puyi was now up for grabs, and within days was swept up by the Japanese legation, who figured that it couldn't hurt to have the former Emperor of China in their back pocket. A few months later, the Japanese disguised Puyi in civilian clothing and put him on a train to Tianjin. Tianjin was a colonial city, divided up into concessions run by the British, French, German, Russian, and Japanese governments. Puyi and his wives were put up in an opulent mansion in the Japanese concession. He proceeded to spend his early 20s partying it up, leveraging his imperial pedigree to gain access to exclusive clubs that normally only admitted white Europeans. Puyi's spoiled playboy lifestyle led to him neglecting his wives, both of whom began to wilt in their new environment. Wanrong developed an opium addiction, while Wen Xiu, in a stunning move, filed for divorce, making her the only imperial concubine in Chinese history to have successfully emancipated herself from her emperor. While in Tianjin, Puyi met with many Chinese warlords, who made grandiose promises to restore him to the Dragon Throne if he funded their armies with what remained of his imperial fortune. Of course, when paid, the warlords just pocketed the money and ran. Puyi's hopes for imperial restoration were further dashed when in 1928, the Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and his National Revolutionary Army managed to reunite the Republic of China. Despite this, the once son of heaven refused to give up on his revanchist aspirations. He would be emperor again, and if China wouldn't give him the throne, well, then he would find a country that would. To that end, Puyi looked eastwards, to the land of his current benefactors. On September 18, 1931, an explosion ripped apart a tract of Japanese-owned railway near the Manchurian city of Mukden, a blast of their own making. This was the false flag operation that marked the moment when Imperial Japan's ambitions of world domination hit full stride. Within months, Japanese troops had overrun Manchuria and annexed the region, establishing a new puppet state, Manchukuo. Everyone in the international community condemned this for what it was, a naked attempt at a colonial land grab. As a result, Manchukuo was left with zero recognition on the world stage. Luckily for the Japanese, they just so happened to have a valuable pawn they could use to give their Manchurian breakaway state a veneer of legitimacy. So it was that on the 1st of March 1932, the last son of heaven was installed as the leader of his ancestral homeland, originally as chief executive of Manchukuo, and in 1934 as Emperor of Manchukuo. For Puyi, it was a hopeful new beginning, and he quickly developed dreams of using Manchuria as a forward base from which he could conquer all of China, just as his Manchu warrior ancestors had done 300 years earlier. These dreams seemingly came one step closer to reality in 1937, when Japan launched its full conquest of all of China. Surely, Puyi reasoned, after the Japanese had subdued the Middle Kingdom, they would install him back onto the Dragon Throne and restore the great Qing Empire to its former glory. Ultimately, however, the idea that Puyi would ever be anything but a showpiece for his Japanese puppet masters was laughable. In theory, Manchukuo was a triumph of Pan-Asianism, a land where Manchus, Mongols, Han Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese lived in harmony under a benevolent Manchu emperor. In reality, that emperor wielded about as much legislative power as a McDonald's crew manager, and the true masters of Manchukuo were the Imperial Japanese Army, who presided over one of the most brutally run countries in the world. Throughout Puyi's so-called reign, Manchu and Han Chinese locals were treated like distant second-class citizens compared to the Japanese colonial elites, and large-scale massacres against Manchu and Chinese civilians were common, usually as disproportionate reprisals against acts of sabotage committed by bands of freedom-fighting partisans. Perhaps most sickening of all was Manchukuo's dubious distinction of hosting Unit 731, the Japanese chemical warfare research cell, responsible for the most stomach-churning acts of torture in human history. As a powerless puppet ruler, Puyi may not have been directly responsible for the atrocities being committed in his name, but he was certainly complicit in them. Even setting that aside, he was hardly a paragon of virtue during these years. Within his imperial estate, he continued the sadistic streak that he had developed as a youth, regularly having his servants whipped for the most minor of infractions. Once, when one of Puyi's page boys fled the salt tax palace to escape his homosexual advances, Puyi ordered the boy flogged mercilessly, resulting in his accidental death. Furious, Puyi ordered the floggers flogged in turn. Trapped in a house of hellish horrors, Puyi's remaining wife, the Empress Wanrong, succumbed to her opium addiction, wasting her life away in a muted daze. This mattered little to Puyi, who satisfied himself with his many other concubines and male lovers. As we all know, the Japanese invasion of China was eventually folded into a little old thing called World War II, and we don't need to recap how that ended. The year was now 1945. Hitler had shot himself in a bunker, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been deleted, and the Soviet Red Army was flooding into Manchuria. On the 16th of August 1945, Puyi officially abdicated as Emperor of Manchukuo. The next task on the agenda was to flee the country with his tail between his legs. He didn't get far, captured by Soviet soldiers in Mukden airport in a futile attempt to board a plane to Japan. His junkie Empress Wanrong fared no better, and was captured by Chinese communist guerrillas while trying to cross the border into Korea. She died alone in a prison a year later from opium withdrawal. The Soviets held on to Puyi for a few years, until Mao Zedong's Communist Party deposed Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists in 1949, at which point the Russians repatriated the Celestial Emperor to the land he once ruled. Rather than execute Puyi as a traitor to the nation, Mao had other plans for him. As the journalist Edward Baer put it, in the eyes of Mao and other Chinese communist leaders, Puyi, the last emperor, was the epitome of all that had been evil in old Chinese society. If he could be shown to have undergone sincere, permanent change, what hope was there for the most die-hard counter-revolutionary? In 1950, Puyi was moved to the Fushun War Criminals Prison in Liaoning Province, where he would spend the next 10 years of his life. For a man who had been steeped in opulent luxury all his life, having to live in a gulag was quite the system shock. For the first time in his life, the former emperor had to do simple tasks for himself, like brush his own teeth and tie his own shoelaces. Throughout his internment, Puyi's communist handlers made sure to expose him to the gravity of the atrocities he had been complicit in. On regular occasions, he was taken out on tours throughout the Manchurian countryside to meet peasants whose families had been tortured by Japanese soldiers. One time he was taken to the city of Harbin to see where the infamous Unit 731 had conducted their horrific human experiments. Another time, Puyi was confronted with one of his former concubines, Li Yuqin. Mrs. Li minced no words with Puyi, condemning him as a lecher who had seen her only as a sex object, and proudly declaring how she was now pregnant by a man who truly loved her. These encounters leadened Puyi's heart, who fell into a deep depression, his self-hatred becoming so strong that many a time he contemplated suicide. In 1959, Mao Zedong declared that Puyi's reprogramming was complete. The former Son of Heaven was a living god no more. From now on, he was an everyday citizen of the People's Republic of China. Puyi was moved to Beijing, where he was allowed to live a normal life and work a normal job, first as a street sweeper and later as a gardener. In these twilight years of his life, the man who had once ruled over 400 million people seemed to find a simple, quiet happiness. He married a hospital nurse, Li Shuqian, and went through life with a meek, humble disposition. In restaurants, he would tell waitresses, "You should not be serving me, I should be serving you." And while in line for a bus, he was always the last to board. Still, echoes of his formerly regal lifestyle still remained with him, as he would regularly forget to flush the toilet or turn the tap off after washing his hands, forgetting he no longer had servants to do these things for him. In 1967, a 61-year-old Gyoro Puyi passed away in a Beijing hospital due to complications arising from kidney cancer and heart disease, and with the death of this simple gardener, the world lost its last living link to the world of ancient China. The last emperor left behind a complex legacy. Was he an irredeemable war criminal, or just a boy helplessly buffeted upon by the hurricane of karma? What do you think? Let us know in the comments below. More biographies on history's most fascinating lives are on the way. To ensure you don't miss them, subscribe and press the bell button. Please consider liking, subscribing, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Recently, we've started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive content. Consider joining their ranks via the link in the description or button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our private Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.